The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Support provided by Milwaukee Public Television and the UWM Center for International Education. Now here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus. Recent events in Egypt have illustrated that the overthrow of an authoritarian leader does not automatically create conditions for democracy to easily take root. Throughout the Arab world, uprisings that were seen in the West as the beginnings of long-awaited political reform have in most cases yet to deliver. Across the region, progressive movements are being challenged by more conservative elements who often position themselves as moderate Islamists. Are they religious pragmatists with whom the U.S. can constructively engage, or dangerous fundamentalists pursuing a strategy of one man, one vote, one time? Our guest today is a keen observer of events in the region. Following a decade of senior management at the World Bank, Salah Brahimi is now president and CEO of Grey Matter International, a Washington-based strategic advisory firm whose areas of focus include international business development, institutional government, and development policy. Salah Brahimi, welcome to International Focus.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
Well, I'm wondering if we could start with just sort of an update, a snapshot of some of the countries that have been in the news over the last 2 years or so, starting with Tunisia, and where are those movements progressing?
Well, I'm going to try and bring on the perspective of those democratic forces here very clearly. We're going to try and stay a little bit objective and analytical, but I do want to impress some opinion into this, based mostly on either direct observation or many interactions with the various democratic forces that are trying to make those Arab uprisings a long-term success, even if in the short term there seems to be quite some trouble brewing. Across the whole set of very different uprisings, there does seem to be quite a bit of trouble brewing right now, and those democratic forces are having difficulty in transforming, let's say, those uprisings into fully fledged democracies. Of course, time is always of the essence, and that cuts both ways. On the one hand, things can get quite urgent. On the other hand, we all know that it's going to take a lot of time. It has to do with the institutional capacity building efforts that will have to be put in place for things to go better on a longer term. Tunisia is a case in point where you have a mostly educated population, if from a poor country, but that was well organized. And where, of course, some of the people that are part of the democratic forces are all the more shocked that it was probably one of the most socially liberal states, with women, thanks to Bourguiba's policies, having quite an important role in society, in the workplace, and so on and so forth. So a lot of people are very scared that this side of Tunisia, which had nothing to do with the nefarious dictatorship side of it, will be sort of the case of the baby being thrown out, of the bathtub with the dirty water. So that's one of the key concerns. A lot of people are saying that Mr. Ghanouchi's Ennahda is sort of the human face for a much uglier hidden face of Salafi neo-fascist rule, and a lot of us are concerned about that, a lot of us that come from the region, because we have seen behaviors very often that indicate this fear not to be groundless, to be based on a credible threat. So this is going to be one of the big issues across the region. If I can generalize, also, the problem is that the democratic forces were quite good at bringing down during the uprisings of dictatorships have shown the limits of their political experience. Those dictatorships repressed political activity for a long time, which means that you find very fragmented, disorganized forces. Whereas on the fundamentalist side, the Muslim Brotherhood has been working, sometimes be it in the shadows, for a longer time, and has a sort of more simple message based on pseudo-theocratic rule, which for populations that are very vulnerable, is something that we can all be worried about. Those simple populist, fascist messages that go through and that are telling everybody, well, if you want stability, it's us, and we're organized. We know what to do. Coming to your question in your introduction right now, I'm one of those that do think that fundamentalists have spawned very dangerous political forces that are closer to neo-fascism than they are to sort of a Muslim democracy. I'm very careful also about wording. I clearly identify them as Islamist and not Islamic, or just Muslim. They like it when journalists, analysts, other people, foreigners mostly, make that mistake or confuse the two together, because of course it gives them sort of a de facto legitimacy and natural leadership of the Arab Islamic world without even needing to be elected for that. I also think that the conditions in which elections such as the one in Egypt took place are probably not the most democratic. Now, of course, those imperfections are to be expected, so it would be a little bit naive for us to have expected otherwise. But the consequence is quite a serious consequence. This is why, perhaps contrary to other parts of the world, I tend to be a little bit more worried when I see this very quick, in 6 months, the Egyptian regime, quickly morphing into a dictatorship with very similar reflexes. On the one hand, to the Mubarak regime, but on the other hand, to what may become even worse than the Mubarak regime because of that, theocratic pseudo Islamist, fascist, ideology.
Well, let's talk a little bit about sort of the social underpinnings of these uprisings really across the board. I mean, we like to think in this country, I think sometimes, that if there's an autocratic regime and there are people battling to topple it, they must be proto-democrats, they must be young Thomas Jeffersons. But there was a much more of an economic component to it, wasn't there?
Look, frankly, there's both. When you look at the kids who used social media to get their message through and had iPhones and all of that, that was more middle class. Now, that is also one of the issues, because the democratic forces were more part of the lower to medium bourgeoisie over there, and because, as we said, under dictatorships, they were not left to organize proper, deep-rooted parties. That's one of the problems. They never managed to transform the uprisings into a proper revolution, create with revolutionary committees and taking over power. What they did is let that power slip and be transferred to the armed forces. And it so happens that it seems that at the helm of those armed forces were officers that did not handle the situation really very well, and that were quickly coerced by the fundamentalists, who in the beginning, I have to remind everybody, were absolutely not part of the initial revolution. Actually, quite cynically, because they had tried and failed before against the regime. Some of them were co-opted. All of that little a game that used to happen under Mubarak, whereby they used to be allowed to field candidacies as independents, and then they take the ruling party's membership card in the National Democratic Party. A lot of National Democratic parties were actually fundamentalists in disguise. And so you have them that actually colluded on the other side. So it's very shocking to Democratic Forces members now who did bring down the regime, with these guys standing on the, the fundamentalists standing on the sidelines and watching, to suddenly be there and be ruled by them now. So that's one of the big issues. Now, to speak to the socioeconomic side, of course, that's where the disorganization of democratic forces means that they were not able to sort of go out and get the vote sufficiently. Although, when you look at it, it's actually quite an indictment for Morsi and the Muslim Brothers that immediately after Mubarak, if it's true as they say, and not all of us are totally convinced of that, but if it's true that it was a 51-49, it's a pretty slim margin to beat Colonel Shafi of the old regime, who was a scarecrow, to most of the population. And a lot of the democratic forces, of course, with lack of experience of some of the youngsters, made the mistake of voting anti-Shafiq and not realizing they're voting pro Morsi then, and made neo-fascist Islamist president who's now suppressing their civil liberties, and put him in power. So it's a bit of a complex situation, and again, the socioeconomics, unfortunately, were not approached very nobly by anyone. Yeah, everybody's at fault there. Democratic forces for not organizing. Also, the fundamentalists, very cynically, who have been working the population and the blue-collar population. From what we've seen from a lot of people who were there, who were assessors of the election, and there was a lot of vote buying from some of the Gulf money that the Muslim Brotherhood and their friends got, that bought poor illiterate people's votes at you have to remember those populations and understand they're already in boom time under Mubarak, the best years for tourism and all of that. These people are already extremely poor. So when everything breaks down, they are at the lowest point ever. It's very, very easy with very little. I was told by one of the prosecutors in Egypt, one of the general prosecutors, who had two big provinces, one Cairo and another rural province, to oversee different, there were three parts of the parliamentary election. And he saw direct vote buying by Salafis and Muslim Brothers, and sometimes in a very, very modest way. 2 liters of vegetable oil, 5 kilos of meat, and 5 pounds of sugar was all it took for some of the very poor people in rural areas to be able to vote for them. So all these things need to be said. I don't know if it's because people don't want to go down into brick clearing, or why. You'll certainly find it on social media. Sometimes journalists will refer to it in a generic way, but I think because they're things that are difficult to prove, but yet everybody in those societies knows they're happening because they see it directly, but they're not journalists, they don't have access, they're not organized, they don't, they're voiceless. This doesn't come out. So I like to always take the opportunity to voice some of those things, even the most uncomfortable parts of this process, this post-dictatorship process, and we're all hoping that it will somehow end well, and that democratic forces in a place like Egypt will end up gaining the upper hand somehow. Although right now the situation is really quite dire.
Well, we'll about to take a short break, but when we come back, I'd like to talk a little bit about what the U.S. role should be in the region. So we'll take it up when we come back with more International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back. We're talking with Salah Brahimi about the Arab uprisings and sort of the state of play currently. Well, I'd like to get into how the U.S. can and should engage, but before we do that, maybe you could talk a little bit about what the perception in the region is about the U.S. involvement to date.
The U.S., of course, understandably, has had to try and make of a rapidly evolving situation the best it could, thinking of its own U.S. national interests. So I think even on the Arab side, there should be a realization that there has to be sort of an adult conversation to have with the United States, and realize that these are issues that touch some of the vital U.S. interests. So I think the U.S. has tried to do what it could with what it had.
But particularly from the side of the democratic forces.
Yes, of course. I'm going to get to that. Look, I am very worried about something, and it is that those democratic forces that would normally be the natural allies of the United States because of the principles and values that its foreign policies purport to support, are so incredibly estranged from it right now. I'm really very worried. I'm worried because it should not be the case. And
how did that happen?
Well, I think that part was the usual, probably fumbling mistakes that what one does when there are sudden shifts and you're not prepared for them. And part is all the exaggerations and conspiracy theories and all the rest that people attach to them and make the situation even worse than it is. Self-fulfilling prophecies. Once people get angry and estranged and all that, it's like, well, you see, it's the evil empire is there, pulling the strings and all of that. I think they're giving sometimes too much credit to the hyperpower of the world. It is a hyperpower on one side, but precisely because it's really busy everywhere. And sometimes there's a lot of self-aggrandizement in our part of the world in thinking that we're at the center of the world, and not realizing that this is just one issue, one geopolitical issue that the U.S. grapples with in a much wider world. So everybody needs to get a bit more realistic. And I mean everybody. I mean on our side, the democratic forces needs to be realistic. They need to be a better partner, better organized, because they need to be appealing to a superpower, hyperpower, to be able to be credible partners. So there's some work. There's a mea culpa and to be had and made by the democratic forces.
Well, and what about that? Do you think, to some extent, there's a danger that we would swap a source of stability in the form of a strong man in a uniform with a strong man with a beard?
I think there's a danger for that. I think there are some people in Washington who have drunk the Kool-Aid. Finally, Muslim brothers are no different than, let's say, right-wing, Christian Democrats in Europe. I beg to disagree strongly. Christian Democrats in Europe are not, rampant neo-fascists and don't have this sort of continuum with Salafism and all kinds of other, toxic ideologies. So I think that is Kool-Aid that they're drinking, and the few people in Washington are doing that. Some of it is tinged with a form of, I'd call it political racism, a bit what Edward Said used to refer to as, Orientalism. These people, they need a strong man, otherwise they can't. It's like the savage that will eventually be civilized, by long-term democracy, but in the meantime, still needs rough handling, and I absolutely despise that way of thinking. Unfortunately, we even have some Arabs that think like that, self-hating Arabs who have that. I don't think that's very helpful to build a healthy society, political, democratic discourse. And I don't think it's true. I think you can have stability with democracy in the Arab world. It is going to take a long time. Education, development, other things are going to have to come into the play. That's where the U.S. can be very helpful. I would urge the U.S. not to disengage just because they were rocked by this trick played onto them on this NGO law thing that we all witnessed. I think that's gotten all of the foreign assistance community a little bit into their shells in the U.S. I think they should, they weren't doing anything wrong, and don't let the populist clamor of the fundamentalists and some pseudo sovereignty nationalists who are not genuine, who were just giving payback to the U.S. for not having helped them within the Mubarak regime. There was a toxic conversion at the time of fundamentalists and Mubarak guys who wanted to depict the democratic forces as U.S. stooges. Unfortunately, that was not handled very well, both on the side of the democratic forces and on the side of the United States. And I think there needs to be a proper dialogue, adult dialogue reestablished between the U.S. and those democratic forces, and perhaps on both sides to try and see, what were the mistakes of the past and how one could move forward. I do not think that fundamentalists offer a good alternative for stability, even as compared to the military strongmen, because those movements, are often pregnant with all sorts of extremism, and the Salafis, to me, are not different. They're a continuum of it. The Salafism and all of those other extremist groups, the Takfir al-Hijra and others, were all bred and brought up under the wings of the mainstream Islamist movement and Muslim Brotherhood. They're the natural children of these guys, and they coalesce with them. Well, actually, when Morsi was in trouble, there was a National Salvation Front on one side, on the democratic forces, and they immediately coalesced on the other side, and you saw people coming out with their militias to try and repress the democratic forces and so on and so forth. So I do think they're a dangerous, unstable, it's a dangerous vector of actually instability. They try to force themselves onto our societies in the Arab world, and I, for one, strongly reject that neo-fascist movement.
Well, and you touched on this in terms of the election results in Egypt, but numerically, I think there's sometimes a perception that they represent a larger portion of the populace than they do.
No, exactly. I think it's what you said. It's larger than they actually do, the perception, because they're well organized and the others aren't. The others on the side that are majority are so fragmented and not united enough. But when you boil the actual numbers, when you go to facts again, facts are always useful in these instances. They're unfortunately too healthy, good 20% or so, which is more or less in times of crisis what you get even in European country for the extreme right wing. The Front National in France scores that type of a score. Marine Le Pen just did, and her father before her, and Switzerland and Belgium. From the Flemish side of Belgium, you've often had that. So it's no different. You always have a fringe of people, and it's going to be the fault of the U.S., the fault of women, the fault of this. The usual populist, extreme right-wing, fascist outlook on the world, and that's it.
And if we were talking about a political environment in which sort of the Islamists were the only force that really had its ground game, if you will, do you think it was a mistake to push the form of the democratic process to the extent that the U.S. did? I mean, was the election timed well, or could we have put it off?
Well, exactly like with Hamas under Bush. I do think that there's often a rush to get to formal democracy, as if you're going to have Jeffersonian democracy with totally different parameters and different parts of the world. Now, this being said, I don't want to push that argument too far into what I said I didn't like before, which is the relativism thing. Like, those countries, you can't do that. They're just not ready for it, and they need a strong man. I wouldn't go as far as to that. But even there, in any country of the world, you do take the circumstances into account. You do take, what's possible, the art of the possible. You also try to make more efforts. You don't let your other regional friends go and fund the most toxic force without applying full pressure. I think, again, a lot of things there was not enough done on other preventative measures, and again, a lot of toxic Gulf dollars went into onto the side that I find to be the wrong side of things.
And is there an ideological congruence there between the Gulf monarchies and these movements, or is it more strategic?
I think it's tactical, actually. And again, I think it's quite misguided. I think some of them, not all, Some of them are purposely. Let me cite the ones who I think are having a positive role. The United Arab Emirates has clearly, because it's been the object of destabilization efforts by people linked actually to the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood and to the wider Arab Muslim Brotherhood locally. They've been the object. They're one of the most, they're probably the most, open and thriving monarchy, set of monarchies, group of monarchies in the Gulf, the United Arab Emirates, and they clearly reject that type of extremism. So there's some light there. I'm seeing actually for example, the Saudis and the Kuwaitis be very, very circumspect now, even if in the past it wasn't always the case, and maybe the monster sort of escaped them at this point. But I do think that there's still a serious problem there in some of them thinking that with the feudal culture of fundamentalist movements, they're going to be able to use these to preempt genuine democracy, lest it become contagious. Over there.
We've got just less than 30 seconds left. Okay. How could the U.S. Best bolster its natural democratic allies in 30 seconds?
Wow, in 30 seconds. I don't know if I can do that in 30 seconds. But anyway, what I can say is I think thoughtful engagement and to build genuine, long-term, difficult, democratic societies is better than thinking you're going to get pseudo-stability to try and find a crutch for perpetuating Camp David and things like that.
Well, we'll have to leave it at that.
And that, yes.
Salah Brahimi, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Viewers, see you next time
on
International Focus.
Cheers. Thanks.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,